Good evening, and thank you for joining New York Jewish Week and UJA Federation of New York for our monthly Folio literary series. I'm Thea Wieseltier, Director of Public Programs at 70 Faces Media, the parent company of New York Jewish Week. It's a pleasure to welcome you tonight to the conversation. We're delighted to have author Matti Friedman with us in conversation with Hilary Krieger, executive editor of JTA and New York Jewish Week. They'll be discussing Matti's new book, Out of the Sky, Heroism and Rebirth in Nazi Europe, the harrowing true story of Hannah Senesh and a group of idealistic young Jewish volunteers on a fatal mission behind enemy lines, and how their story became intertwined with the founding story of Israel. We're also grateful to our partner, UJA Federation. UJA's work in Israel began long before the State of Israel was declared and remains central to its mission today, serving the needs of all Israelis, strengthening the bond between Israel and the diaspora, and supporting a Jewish democratic state of Israel. And since October 7th, UJA has provided more than $330 million to support the physical, emotional, and economic healing needed to carry Israel forward. And with that, let's now turn to our program and our guest author, Matti Friedman. Matti is a Canadian-Israeli journalist, author, and Jerusalem-based columnist for the Free Press. Born in Toronto and based in Jerusalem, he is widely recognized for his writing on Middle Eastern affairs, Israel, and Jewish history. Hilary and Matti, I welcome you to the stage.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you and especially to get to talk to Matti about his new book. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk with us, Matti, and to answer some questions from me and from the audience about Out of the Sky, Heroism and Rebirth in Nazi Europe. And there should be a link in the chat for those who are interested in purchasing a copy of this great book themselves. Um, Matti, do you want to start by just telling us a little bit about the book and why you decided to write it at this point in time?
Sure. First of all, Hillary, thanks so much for doing this, and thanks to Thea and the folks from 70 Faces. It's great. It's great to be with you. I wish we could be doing this in person at a real event in New York or thereabouts. But I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem. This will have to do for now. This is a story that I think many of us know, or at least think we know or know something about. If you had any kind of Jewish education, you probably heard about Hannah Senesh or played. Several friends who played Hannah Senesh in school productions. Many of us probably sang Eli Eli at some point, whether it was at a Jewish school or at a summer camp. So this is a myth that's been floating around the Jewish world since it happened, more or less, since 1944. But few of us know anything about it. So even in Israel, the name Hannah Senesh is probably one of the most famous names. So if you ask an Israeli if they know that name, almost everyone here would say yes. She's as famous, I would say, as Judah the Maccabee or maybe Theodore Herzl. Everyone knows the name. There are 32 Hannah Senesh streets in Israel. There are other kibbutzim named after different participants in this mission because Hannah was just one of 32 parachutists who took part in this mission. So this is a story that's kind of encoded in the Israeli landscape. If you drive around Israel, you'll pass kibbutz Netzer Sereni, which is near Rehovot. That's named after Enzo Sereni, who is a great Italian character who was the commander of the mission. Kibbutz Lavot Chaviva, named after Chaviva Reich, who's kind of Hannah's rival as the heroine of the mission. Alone Abba, which is named after another parachutist, Abba Berdichev. So the story was important enough to be coded into the Israeli landscape, but no one knows what the story is. So if you ask people, they couldn't really tell you what the connection is between the characters. And if you dive into it even deeper, you'll find out something that I found quite striking, which is that we know this as a myth, a Zionist myth, about a group of heroic Jews who set off at the darkest moment in Jewish history, perhaps 1944, to save Jews and fight the Nazis. That's why they're famous. That's the legend. But if you look at it closely, you find that they don't seem to have saved a single Jew or killed a single Nazi. So what's the story, and how did they become legends? That's what got me interested in this strange episode initially.
I'm very interested by your use of the word myth to describe what happened, since these are true events that you're narrating throughout the course of the book. Can you talk a little bit about why you're using that word and why you think that's the right word to use?
What's interesting here is the gap between the myth that we know, and the real people who embarked on this mission. There's always a large gap between any legendary story and what actually happened. That goes without saying. And in this case, the gap seemed interesting to me and worth investigation. So, we have these legendary characters who are almost two-dimensional poster children. Like Hannah Senesh is kind of a Davy Crockett character in Israel. She's just this image, this very kind of stylized image of a young woman in a British military tunic, kind of smiling and saluting as she goes off, to sacrifice herself for Zionism. But who was she really? Who was Hannah Senesh? Why did she do what she did? I mean, these were people who escaped the Holocaust, made it to relative safety in the land of Israel. It was then British Mandate Palestine, and volunteered to go back. And why did they do that? And why did they do that given the um, almost certainty that the mission would fail? And why did they do that knowing, as many of them did, that they were unlikely to return? So the humans behind the myth are very, very interesting. And the process in which these very real people, flawed people, people with a lot of like wrinkles and bumps, not at all two-dimensional caricatures, how do they become myths? How do we get, the myth of Hannah Senesh and this, song that many of us know, Eli Eli? How does that remain from a very messy human story that takes place in 1944, does not go as planned, yields none of the expected results, and yet, becomes one of the most enduring legends of Zionism?
So was there something in particular that you felt that you uncovered in chronicling this that really jarred you in terms of the contrast between the myth and the reality, or just generally, is there something or a few things that really surprised you in general, given what you came in knowing about this and versus what you came out with at the end?
Yes, I mean there were many surprises in this story. I mean the contours of the story were surprising to me because I just didn't know them, and I think many of us don't know them. This is I'll just give the kind of the very short version of the mission, which is in itself surprising. This was a British mission, which is kind of downplayed in the legend that many of us know. This was a mission run by an office of British intelligence called MI9, which is a cousin of MI5 and MI6, which still exist. MI9 no longer exists. It was in charge of escape and evasion in the Second World War. So that basically means extracting downed Allied pilots behind enemy lines and getting POWs who are, who have escaped behind enemy lines, getting them back to Allied lines. So there's an office that's running these escape routes around the Mediterranean and the Balkans, and it's their mission. So the Zionists are partnering with the British. But the guy in charge of this mission is a British officer by the name of Tony Simmons, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Simmons. And the whole British side of the mission was quite surprising to me because I always thought of this as, an act of Zionist heroism, but they wore British uniforms. They had British aliases, and they were serving British intelligence, even though none of them were British. And in fact, none of them had ever been in Britain. And at the time, the Zionist movement and the British were actually at odds. In 1944, the Zionists are furious that the British are preventing refugees from reaching Palestine, which is the only possible refuge, and millions of people are being murdered in Europe, and the British are blocking them from escape. So there's no love lost between the Jews here and the British. However, the Jews are obviously not going to be on the Nazi side in the war. They're going to have to fight alongside the British. So the Jews decide to partner with the British in this mission and recruit ultimately 32 parachutists from the young Jews who've been arriving in the land of Israel, speaking useful Central European languages, which is what the British are looking for. So Hungarians, Romanians, Serbians, Slovaks. That's what's needed. So I guess that surprised me that it was actually a mission run by two rivals, each of which had a very different interpretation of what was going on. The British thought that these people were being sent to rescue pilots. They thought they were using Jews. The Jews thought that they were using the British because the Jews weren't not that interested in rescuing down pilots, although they were happy to do it if they could. But what they really wanted to do was save Jews, and they just had no way of getting into Europe if they didn't joined the British Army because the Jews obviously had no air force and no army of their own. So they needed to become British soldiers to do it. So they refer to the British mission as a plane ticket. That's all it was. They were just trying to get into Europe somehow. And the British had this understanding that the Jews have kind of a superpower, which we don't think about that much. But the British, although they saw the Jews as a real pain in the neck because they were constantly rebelling, they understood that Jews have really a superpower, which is that they have double identities. Or maybe triple identities, which is something that we take for granted. But many Jews have multiple names, and certainly back then spoke multiple languages and could be different things. So you had Zionist pioneers in the land of Israel who were also, they could also pass as Hungarians, they could pass as Frenchmen, they could be Polish, they could be German. And this is very useful for intelligence. They could be Arabs. And all of these realizations are put into effect in the Second World War. Another book of mine is called Spies of No Country, and it's about the birth of the Mossad, which is essentially a British operation that realizes that Jews coming from the Arab world can be sent back into the Arab world as Arabs. So Jews have this double thing going on, which is actually it's a deep part of our history. I mean, many of our greatest stories are stories about double identity. For example, the book of Esther is a story about a Jewish girl in Persia who has a Hebrew name. Her name's Hadassah, but she also has a Persian name, which is Esther. And using her Persian identity, she gets into the king's court. So she's in position to sway events when that becomes necessary. But it's almost a spy story. It's a story of double identity. The story of Joseph is a story of double identity. Joseph is so Egyptian by the time his brothers show up in Egypt that they don't recognize him. So he's become unrecognizable, and he has a Hebrew name, Yosef, and he has an Egyptian name, which is Tzofnat Pa'aner. So this is also a story of double identity. Moses is a story of double identity. So, and this is a very deep thing about Jews, and the British pick it up and they use it for their intelligence purposes. Meanwhile, the Jews think that they're using the British. So I guess that was one part of the story that surprised me. There are many other, human wrinkles here that, there were. Love affairs between the parachutists. Chaviva Reich, who is a fascinating character who's kind of existed in the shadow of Hannah Senesh since the mission. She was an incredible character in many ways, a very modern character, very complicated life, which is one of the reasons that we know Hannah and don't know much about Chaviva Reich. So that was surprising, and in a way that kind of brings them to life. And one last thing I would say is that I thought of Hannah Senesh as a great kind of Israeli heroine. And then, of course, we associate her with Eli Eli, which is maybe the most famous song in modern Hebrew. But if you go to the National Library in Jerusalem and you look at the first draft of that song, which is on display in the National Library, I highly recommend a visit if any of you are near Jerusalem. You can see the first version of Eli Eli, and you can see that in the first line, there's a spelling mistake. So Hannah Senesh has written Eli shelo yigamer leolam. That's the first line of the poem. Lord, I pray that these things never end. And she's written the word leolam with an aleph instead of with an ayin, which is a classic new immigrant to Israel mistake, but it's one of the most famous songs in Hebrew. So it's like finding a spelling mistake in Yeats or something. It's really striking. She was a new immigrant. Hannah Senesh was in Israel only for a few years, and she was Hungarian. And she was the daughter of a very well-known Hungarian playwright. And she came from a very literary home. And when the Hungarians ultimately catch her, they know her last name. It's kind of like catching the daughter of Amos Oz or something. So she's a Hungarian character more than she's an Israeli character. And I think that was also surprising to me, although I guess it shouldn't have been.
Fascinating, really fascinating. And you're noting that Hannah is the name that people know, but there were a lot of other parachutists. And I'm wondering if you talked about how this is a British mission, and if you want to choose one of the other characters and tell a little bit about their story and just give the outlines for people of what that heroic course they took was. I think, each one is distinct, but I think they mostly follow the same general trajectory. So I think it just will help maybe paint a little bit of a picture of what people were doing before we drill down a little bit more.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there are 32 parachutists. You can't write a book about 32 people. I chose 4 characters who are the main characters of the book. One of them is Hannah, of course, because you can't write this story without Hannah Senesh. One of them is Chaviva Reich, who is, again, a heroic female character. more effective as a parachutist than Hannah Senesh. In fact, she may have been the most effective of all the parachutists on the ground. She operated in Slovakia, in the town where she was born, which is a place called Banska Bystrica, which I actually visited when I was researching the book. Another character is Chaim Hermesh, who wrote a book about the mission and who is not famous at all, mainly because he survived. So he might not have understood the mission. He came back alive and wrote a book about it, which is an incredible book that kind of allowed me to flesh out many of the details of the mission because he saw the events, of course, himself and wrote about them. Very narrowly escaped death. And the fourth character, and maybe I'll talk about him, just I'll give a few sentences about him. It might be my favorite, and that's Enzo. Enzo Sereni, who I mentioned, this Italian, he's an Italian Jewish aristocrat. Basically, he's from Rome. His dad was a physician in the court of the Italian king, and he had a PhD, and he's this incredibly educated and kind of erudite Italian character. He was initially an Italian nationalist, then was kind of disavowed with the rise of or disillusioned, I guess I would say, as Mussolini and the fascists rose, and he becomes a Zionist, and he moves to what is then British Mandate Palestine, and he founds a kibbutz, which still exists to this day, Givat Brenner. He founds it along with his wife, Ada Sereni, who actually plays a role in this story later on. So these are two kind of heroic Italians. And what's amazing about him is that he's so unmilitary, which is really true, I think, of all of these characters. If we think of them as military heroes, if they showed up, and I write this in the book, if they showed up at a recruiting office today, no one would take them. Like, they were completely unfit for the mission. I guess the question is, for what mission? And that's really the central question of the book. What was the mission? But certainly for the mission that they seem to be embarking on, they're completely unprepared. I mean, Enzo is short and overweight, and he has glasses, and he's just not a military character. His superpower is really literature. He's a writer. He dreams of writing a great multi-generational novel about his family in Italy. He edits a book before the mission. The book is an amazing read because it's so crazy to read now. It's about Arab-Jewish coexistence under Zionist socialism. So reading it now is like an acid trip or something, but it made sense in the 1930s. That was Enzo. He wrote another book about the rise of fascism in Italy, which is published posthumously. So Enzo is the commander, essentially, of the mission. He's one of the commanders. He's on the ground running this thing from first from Egypt and then from Italy. He's not supposed to jump. He's not supposed to jump himself into Europe. He is 39 years old, so he's much older than everyone else. He has 3 kids who he's left behind on the kibbutz. He's merely meant to be running this from the rear, and so because of his literary understanding, he knows that you can't send people to their deaths if you're not willing to do it yourself. And because he has a perception of himself as a hero, the hero can't be at headquarters, right? Like, Odysseus doesn't, run things from the rear. You have to be there. You have to jump yourself. So he disobeys orders. The entire Zionist leadership is telling Enzo, you may not jump into occupied Europe. You're too important. You're too old. You have children. Be responsible. Don't do this. And he does it anyway. And he gets on an airplane flying into northern Italy, which is still occupied in the spring of 1944. He's dropped because of a navigational error by the British pilot. He's dropped essentially on top of a German army camp. So the Wehrmacht just captures him more or less as he lands, and he disappears. I trace his fate in the book, but yes, that's the story of a great and kind of wild and romantic Zionist hero who unfortunately has been largely forgotten.
So do you think then that the focus on Hannah Senesh and the fact that she's the name everyone knows, that feels unfair, and that, if you could talk about, I guess, a little bit about why she's been the face of the mission that included 32 people, and whether you think that she sort of deserves the place that she's been given, or if other people maybe should be sharing that podium alongside her.
Totally. I mean, that was the feeling that I had when I started writing this book. One of my goals at the beginning was to kind of play down Hannah a bit, not play her down more than she deserves, but to make room for other characters, because the only name that is remembered today is Hannah Senesh. The mission is basically Hannah Senesh, but there were 32 parachutists. So why should it be all about Hannah Senesh, and I really wanted to kind of shrink her character in the book. And as I wrote, her character just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger until I was forced to admit that there is a reason that Hannah Senesh is the heroine of the mission. And the reason has nothing to do with military achievement. Hannah Senesh had no military achievement. I mean, as I said about the mission writ large, she did not save a single Jew or kill a single Nazi. So why did Hannah Senesh become this great military heroine who is as well known as, Moshe Dayan in Israel? Just to give you an illustration of that, one of my kids came home a few years ago with a pack of playing cards, like Zionist patriotic playing cards. So they were in sets of four. So there's like 4 Israeli cities and 4 kibbutzim, and there were 4 great Zionist heroes. So it was Theodor Herzl, Moshe Dayan, Golda Meir, and Hannah Senesh. Like, she's in the top pantheon of Zionism, and yet she seems to have achieved absolutely nothing. So what is going on? And it's really the question about this mission. What is going on? The mission was a complete failure. It didn't do anything that it was supposed to accomplish. Why did it become a legend? And I think that the key can be found in one particular moment in the story. And it's a moment that happens at the beginning of June 1944. And it's the moment where Hannah is about to cross from occupied Yugoslavia, which is where she's been dropped, into occupied Hungary, which is where she's from. And her mother at this time is in Budapest, the Hungarian capital. And living not far away from her mother is Adolf Eichmann, who is in Hungary, essentially engineering the murder of all the Jews in Hungary. So the Jews of rural Hungary have already been mostly murdered by June. The Jews of Budapest have been left for last, and Hannah's mother is in Budapest. So she is insisting on crossing the border into Hungary. And the other parachutists who are with her in Yugoslavia don't want her to go. One of the interesting things or surprising things that you find when you read the documents and letters from the time is that Hannah's comrades didn't really like her. Which is kind of a funny thing to realize if you grew up with this, perfect kind of Joan of Arc character. But the other parachutists didn't like her. They were men, and she was very stubborn, very opinionated. She didn't accept their authority. She thought they were as smart as them. They found that very annoying. So they're telling her not to cross the border because they understand that if she crosses into occupied Hungary, she's probably not coming back. There's a lot of Gestapo along the borders. She's going to get caught, and she's not going to come back. And by the way, they're right about that. That is exactly what's going to happen. But Hannah is not willing to listen to them, and she's insisting on crossing the border. So another parachutist named Reuven Daphne, who survives and gives us this account, is accompanying her to the border. And it's at night. They're in the forest along the Yugoslav-Hungary border, and they're about to part. So she's about to leave on this mission, and they're never going to see each other again. And Reuven Daphne and Hannah shake hands in the forest, and Hannah presses into his hand a folded sheet of paper. So he feels that she's kind of passing him a sheet of paper in his hand. And this is an incredibly cinematic gesture. I mean, this is like a scene out of literature. Hannah, as I mentioned, is the daughter of a playwright. So she grew up at her father's theater premieres. She grew up going to the theater. She grew up reading books. She read an incredible number of books, which we know because she kept a reading list from age 12. And she wrote down every single book she read, and we still have the list. So we can just tell that she was a bookworm. And so this seems like a scene out of literature or out of the theater. Not coincidentally, that was Hannah's world. She had a sense of what a heroic quest looks like and what her role is. So the heroine is about to, stride off to meet her fate. She leaves a last message to, this is classic. So she gives this folded up note to Daphne. Daphne is so annoyed by this that he throws it away because he understands himself as being part of an actual military mission. And who is this young woman who's doing this theatrical thing? I mean, this is total bullshit. Just forget it. He throws it away and leaves. And about an hour later, according to his account, he realizes that he probably shouldn't have thrown away Hannah Senesh's last message, and he goes back to find it. And luckily for us, he finds it in one of the bushes. And I saw it a few months ago. It's about the size of an index card, and it's been folded. And on this piece of paper, when he unfolds it, he sees 4 lines of poetry. And this is Hannah Senesh's second most famous poem. The most famous is Eli Eli. But this is the second most famous poem. And I think the poem is kind of the key to what's going on. The first line of the poem is, maybe some of you know it. אשרי הגפרור שנשרף והצית להבות. Happy is the match that burned and lit the flames, or happy is the match that flared and lit the flames. So what is Hannah telling us with this poem? And what is she saying, right? She's about to leave on a mission that she quite clearly understands she's not coming back from. She's the match, right? Happy is the match that flared and lit the flames. She's the match. She's going off. She's not going to save the Jews of Hungary, obviously. She's one 22-year-old woman. She's not going to defeat the Wehrmacht. She's going to flare like a match. And the act of burning herself is going to light the flames. So the story of what she's doing is going to light some kind of flame in the future that will give people inspiration. She's going to light the way for other people and show them how to act. So I think that Hannah's explaining to us in this note, which is, I mean, it's essentially a suicide note, or at the very least, it's a last will and testament. She's telling us what the mission is. The mission was never military. The mission is literary. The mission is to tell a different story about the Holocaust. And it's going to be a Zionist story. What is a Zionist story? A Zionist story is a story in which the Jews are actors and not props. So, the story is going to be of heroic people who jump out of airplanes with weapons and go off to save other Jews, even if the mission fails and even if they don't make it back. The story will live on, and it does. I mean, it sounds kind of naive, but we're talking about this story more than 80 years later. So clearly the story lives on. 4 years after this mission, young Jewish fighters in the land of Israel set off to create a Jewish state in the War of Independence. 6,000 of them died doing it. And we have a state that I'm sitting in right now because of them. And they march off to battle in many cases, singing the songs written by Hannah Senesh. They're singing Eli, Eli, and Asher Gafur, Happy is the Match. They sing those songs in 1948. So they have her example as an ideal that they need to emulate if we're going to have a revolution in Jewish history that is going to save us from passivity and lead us to action and to statehood. That's what they're doing in this mission. It's not a military mission. It's really a literary mission. It's about writing a story, and they're writing the story with, quite literally, with their blood.
And so you've used, I think, the word suicide mission, and you certainly talk about, Enzo sending people to their deaths, et cetera, that basically it was understood what was going to happen. And so first of all, do you think that was understood both by the participants and also by the commanders? And to the extent that that was the case, especially on the part of the commanding officers, especially the British, who were ostensibly not writing a story, but were trying to rescue downed airmen. I mean, do you think that was an ethical choice to send these people into almost certain death? And certainly from the Zionist, for the Zionist piece of it, that, the idea of martyring people for the sake of a story, was a reasonable decision for those people who facilitated and watched it happen, given that how doomed the mission seems to have been clear to be.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, when we read the writing of Hannah and Enzo and Chaviva, we see that they understand they're probably not coming back. I mean, all three of them talk about that explicitly. I mean, no one thinks they're parachuting into occupied Nazi Europe and like strolling out. It's understood that your chances of survival are slim. For the British, it doesn't matter that much. I mean, it's kind of a cruel thing to say, but the stories of special operations, British special operations in Europe throughout the Second World War are full of these very kind of forlorn foreign characters being dropped all over the place and usually never coming back. So, they're dropping agents in France and they're getting caught. Some of you probably know the story of the assassination of Heydrich in Prague, which is done by a Czech and a Slovak parachutist, and they do manage to kill Heydrich, but they don't make it back. So they're kind of expendable. That's the truth. These agents are expendable. They're not British. I mean, even British agents might have been expendable, but certainly foreigners were. So, the British thought, great, if these people can help us out, they were dropped with radio transmitters. They speak local languages. If they can help us as liaisons with local partisans and get out some of our, air crew, amazing. If they don't come back, whatever, basically. And not just that, there's a quote, and it's in the book, an incredible quote from Lord Moyne, who's the top British official. He's in charge of the Middle East. And he's aware of this mission. And he says, and this is more or less an exact quote, he says, if we manage to take out some of the most brave and capable Jews in Palestine, and they don't come back, that's great for us. Because the British are at odds with the Jews. So he says, if we send them into Europe and they die, we benefit. The British Empire actually benefits. So that's the attitude of the British. As for the Jewish commanders, it's more ambiguous. And I think you're right. Judaism sanctifies life. We're not really into suicide. There was always this, the Masada myth in the early years of Israel, which was this myth of, not a myth. I mean, it seems to be or at least to some extent, a true story of mass suicide on top of Masada. And early Zionism venerates that idea. And then kind of becomes uncomfortable with it because we're not actually supposed to glorify suicide. Judaism actually is not into that at all, where you kind of, the idea is to survive and live. But this is a time when death is just surrounding everyone. I mean, 6 million people are being murdered. It's the families of all of the participants in the mission and their commanders. Life just means something different in a time like that. And many of the participants and the commanders, I think, felt that they just could not sit in safety while their parents or siblings are being butchered in Europe. Certainly Hannah felt that. And her mother was literally, a mile away from Eichmann's villa in Budapest. So the idea of living your life when that is happening, I think, was very hard for them to bear. But that ambiguity is definitely present in this mission. I mean, if you understand that the mission is unlikely to achieve anything and people are unlikely to come back, what are you doing exactly? And I think what they would say is that these people are in the service of Jewish history, and we have a history of very powerful stories, and the Jews needed to be moved at precisely this time from passivity to action. And we kind of take for granted that we're people of action, but it's only because we've grown up in the revolution created by Hannah Senesh and Enzo Sereni. So we grew up with the state of Israel, and we kind of take for granted that we have an army and that we act. And people are murdered at kibbutzim near Gaza on October 7th, and people from Jerusalem or Tel Aviv go to save them. That just makes instinctive sense to us, but it didn't in 1944. And Jews had many different ways of dealing with catastrophe. You could, you could recite psalms, you could pray, you could go into the basement and lock the door and wait for things to blow over. You could collaborate with the authorities. There are many ways to deal with a catastrophe. And Zionism is trying to say no. When faced with catastrophe, the thing to do is act. You have to act. And it's a lesson for today as well, but that's the Zionist message. And the Zionist youth movements are trying to inculcate this, and it's very much the story of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which is led by Zionists, people who think in the same way. They know the uprising is going to fail. Of course, they do it anyway because as one of them said, I think it was one of the fighters from the Lodz Ghetto, he said, "We're fighting and dying for 3 lines in a history book." I mean, it takes a leap to inhabit that headspace, but that's very much where they were.
So 2 words, I think, seem really emblematic of this book. And I wonder how you define them and relate to them as, descriptors for your subjects, if you would, you in fact use them as such. One is heroism and one is resistance. Right.
I mean, I guess those are the 2 key words here. There's a funny is totally the wrong word here, but 2 of the minor characters write last letters before their execution in a Slovak jail at the very end of 1944. One of them is Tzvi Ben Yaakov, and one of them is Rafi Rice, and they've been captured along with Chaviva Reich by Nazi forces after a battle in a forest in Slovakia, and they're in a prison and they're about to be executed. And they both write letters that they managed to smuggle out, and both letters make it to the land of Israel, and we have the letters. And in both of the letters, which are written in different cells, so they're not writing these letters together, both of them write, "Do not make me a hero. Do not make me a hero after my death. What I did was not heroism. I just did what I had to do." And it's really striking. Also because they both wrote it, and also because, of course, that's what a hero would say. What else would a hero say? Of course, you say, I'm not really a hero. So they're very conscious of the kind of the heroic storytelling that is going to go on, and in fact is already going on. The letters indicate that they know this is going to happen, because in some ways they've been sent in service of a, the creation of stories of Jewish heroism, which are rare in 1944. Again, we have to kind of like go back 80 years and remember there aren't a lot of Jewish military heroes. I mean, there's Trumpeldor, which is a very kind of ambiguous story from early Zionism, but there's no tradition of Jewish military heroism. The Zionist movement is trying to resuscitate figures like Bar Kokhba, in order to give the Jews military heroes, but we don't really have any. So the characters, in a very self-conscious way, set out to become heroes. That's what they're supposed to do. And that is what Hannah is doing in the forest. She's acting like a heroine. And she knows how to be a heroine because she has read probably too many books. So she has the idea. And Enzo knows he has to be a hero. And he knows that means he has to jump. He can't send other people to jump. And he has to jump, even if it doesn't make any sense for him to jump. And indeed, it ends tragically. So heroism is very much the word that's kind of floating over the mission. And it's interesting to think of that from our own times in 2026. We're in a very anti-heroic age. I mean, in 1944, I think the human response to heroism would be to say, wow, I want to be like that. I want to be like Hannah Senesh. I want to be like George Washington. I want to be like, Augie Murphy, Moshe Dayan, whatever, John McCain. I want to be like these heroes. I want to emulate them. But at some point that changes and we become suspicious of heroes. So then our response to heroism becomes, let's tear these people down. Like there's a distance between us and a hero, and it makes us uncomfortable because these people are better than us. So we have to reconcile that in some way, either by reaching their height or by tearing them down to our own size. And I think the response today is to do the latter. And the best example of that, I think, was President Trump's response to McCain. If you remember, McCain was a prisoner of the North Koreans for, I think, 6 years, underwent terrible torture, walks out of the prison in the most noble way possible. And President Trump said of him, "I prefer people who weren't caught." So this is an unheroic person bringing a hero down, but it's very much what we all do. Now when we see a hero, we say, "Oh, that guy's an alcoholic. He was terrible to his family. He's not really a hero. He was doing it for selfish reasons." So in order to kind of appreciate these heroes, we have to re-inhabit that ability to look up to heroes. I'm not sure what we're going to do without heroes. I mean, I think one of the ills of present day society is that we don't have heroes anymore. So, in an absence of heroes, everything just becomes ridiculous and corrupt. You need something to look up to. And in 1944, that was still understood. In Israel, to some extent, it's still understood. I mean, because heroism is required of us and of our children on a daily basis. But in much of the West, the idea of a hero is very much under fire, and people emulate different role models, celebrities, maybe athletes. I'm not sure that our societies are going to survive in those conditions, which also makes it interesting to think about heroism in this story.
It's interesting to hear you say that, because I do think one of the things you come away from this book with is, like you said, a sort of humanizing of these people. And that means that they're flawed, right? I mean, that's what humans are, is flawed people. You find out that, as you said, people didn't like Hannah. They really didn't like Haviva. And so in a way, it feels like there is a little bit of deconstruction going on in terms of the idea of hero in this book. So sort of how are you reconciling that with what you were just saying about the need for heroes, and how it does seem that you perceive these people as heroes, despite not having succeeded in the military component, at least, of the mission they were in?
Right. I do think that they're heroes. And the book actually makes a case for their heroism in a different way. Because I think that if we understand that these are real people, and if we can get as close to them as possible, which we can because they left a lot of writing, that makes them more heroic. Like, if you understand that Hannah Senesh is a bookworm who's kind of stubborn and prickly, that makes her more heroic, because she suddenly seems like a real person and not like a caricature. And if we understand that Haviva is this really complicated character, and she's kind of involved in like multiple impossible relationships with men at the same time of the mission, and she's kind of looking for something and she can't find it, and parallel to this, she's doing the most heroic thing possible by parachuting back into her now occupied home country of Slovakia. I mean, it makes them greater. It makes them much greater. So the impulse that says in order to have a hero, we have to airbrush them, I don't think that holds water, certainly not in 2026. Hannah Senesh was not Joan of Arc. And in fact, Joan of Arc wasn't Joan of Arc. I mean, like these are all humans, and that's what makes them so amazing, and that's what's inspiring to us because we're also humans, and we can also do heroic things. These are not a different. It's not a different breed of. It's not a different species. These are people like us who made incredible decisions that we still remember. So it's their humanity that makes them heroic. So in the book, I try to deconstruct the caricatures and then kind of rebuild them as actual people who do something really heroic, which is not military heroism. So the mission is not a successful commando mission, which is the way people have tried to present it, because we really wanted a story of Holocaust heroism. Like we wanted a story that was, like a great secret mission into Europe. And one of the reasons that the story has kind of been abandoned in recent decades is that it doesn't make sense. It doesn't hold water as a real story of heroism because that was never the mission. It's not really about military heroism. It's about storytelling, which is one of the great Jewish talents. I mean, in 1944 was basically the only weapon in our arsenal. All we had was stories. We had nothing else. And the Zionist movement used to be very good at employing stories as weapons. We're not good at it right now, but we were good at it. So it's an opportunity to think about what real heroism looks like. And I do think that we need it. I mean, we need it now, and it's not necessarily going to be military heroism. It's not going to be people jumping out of airplanes, and or it could be. I mean, literally, people in Israel have to do that all the time. But we need a lot more heroism. I think we need heroism in our community. There's a lot of we're in a dark time that has come to many of us unexpectedly, and people are trying all of the usual repertoire of ways to deal with it. Collaborating, ignoring it, hoping it's going to blow over, reciting prayers or whatever. We're going to need to be a bit heroic here. I mean, people are going to actually have to stand up and take action that might not work. I mean, that's not a very 2026 thing to say. We might have to take action that will fail in the short term, but will be remembered by our children or grandchildren as having been the right thing to do, if not heroic. And that is very much the headspace of Hannah Senesh and her comrades. It's very much not our headspace, but I think that we can regain it.
I think that all segues really well into a question that we have from the audience, and which I'll read in just a second. But just a reminder, if people do want to ask questions, please drop them in the Q&A. You can also find the link to the book if this is sparking your interest in reading it. If you haven't yet, please do get a copy. Nina asks, she says that you're telling a very powerful, inspiring story. I agree. I cannot help but wonder in what ways its resonance has shifted, especially post October 7th, or even if it's even lost its resonance to many Israelis.
First of all, you don't have to read the book; you just have to buy it. What you do after you buy it, I'll never ask. I actually think, I mean, I started writing this book a year before October 7th. First of all, thank you for that question. And the book really starts a year before October 7th with these questions about mythology. And I mean, I do a lot of the research before October 7th, and then October 7th happens. And after October 7th, to me, the story becomes much easier to understand, which is a weird thing to say. And I realize that's not my only takeaway from October 7th, but suddenly we find ourselves in a world that is much more similar to the world of the characters than the world of October 6th. And I'm not saying that we're in the 1930s, and I'm not saying that this is the Holocaust, and I don't like that kind of simplistic, parallel thinking. However, I think that many of us thought before October 7th that we more or less had the world figured out, and that the Jewish problem in the diaspora had been solved by liberal democracy, and that the Jewish problem in the Middle East had been solved by Zionism. And when I moved from Toronto, which is where I grew up, to Israel in 1995, I thought I was moving between two solutions. Like life in Canada would be great thanks to Western democracies, and life in Israel would be great because of Zionism. And then on October 7th, we realized that none of that is true. So liberal democracy is actually not going to protect Jews. And in fact, the order that we grew up in, the post-World War II order, is fraying and disintegrating. At the same time, on October 7th, in the sovereign state of Israel, we had images that looked like images from Kishinev or from some pogrom in the 1600s, where the Cossacks are in the village raping women and kidnapping children and murdering people in their kitchen. So we're not free of Jewish history in the way that we thought. And suddenly I'm in a world that is much more similar to the world of Hannah Senesh. Because these characters, Hannah and Enzo and Chaviva and Chaim, they move in a world that offers them no good options. There is no state. They hope there will be. That doesn't seem likely. They live in a British, mandate territory where they have no power. Go back to Europe, which is occupied by people who are murdering their families and friends, and even their own allies in Europe hate Jews. So, and this is a kind of a constant theme in the book where they're with, for example, Tito's partisans in Yugoslavia, and they're fighting with the Allies. But the parachutists realize very early on that they cannot reveal that they're Jews because the partisans, although they're communists fighting alongside the British, they don't like Jews. So the parachutists actually start lying about where they're from because the partisans notice that they don't sound British. They have to come up with some other story, and they start saying that they're Welsh because no one knows what Welsh sounds like or what a Welsh accent sounds like. So they come up with this whole story about how they miss Cardiff in Wales, which is a place that none of them have ever been. So they're in this world which is quite dark, and there's this glimmer of a crack in history, which is the possibility of a Jewish state. And they decide they're going to jam their fingers in the crack and they're going to try to widen it and get as many people through as possible. But their world is scary and ambiguous and not sunny. And I think that October 7th made their world much easier for me to understand, as strange as that may sound.
So you write in the introduction, rather than this simply being a true story, quote, "This is a true account of my journey into their story." And at several points, you note your own efforts to find more information and your own sense of each person and your interaction with the material and the people and your perceptions of them. Why was it important to write this as a dialogue between you and the information you uncovered rather than a straight narrative of the event?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a journalist like craft question.
I'm a journalist, full disclosure.
Yeah, I know. I know, you can tell. And it's something we struggle with as journalists. My journalistic boot camp was really at the AP, which is a news agency. And of course, at the AP, there's no first person. Like, you're never in the story. For many years, I thought that using the first person was kind of narcissistic. Like, what are you doing in the story? Just write the story. By the way, I still think that's sometimes true, but often the absence of the storyteller in the story is a fiction that's actually a bigger lie than anything else. Because of course you're in the story. Like, of course Matti Friedman is telling the story. Who else is telling the story? So pretending that I'm not there or that I'm just a mirror, like a passive mirror, that's not honest either. So in this book, to a greater extent than in my 4 previous books, I'm here as a guide to the reader. The story is very complicated and it happens in different places, involves different people. It's not really a unified narrative, which I hope the reader doesn't really notice, because I'm creating a unified narrative by being in it. Like, the glue that sticks the pieces of the story together is my character and the way that I'm kind of moving through my own investigation of the story. And I'm also trying to bring the reader into the moment when this story is being written, which is in the middle of a terrible war in Israel. And I don't make much of it, but I do explicitly reference it at one point in the book in a way that I hope kind of makes this story alive now. This isn't a nostalgic book. It's a story being written right now at a particular moment in Jewish history. And I needed to be there to make that point as well. So I hope I didn't overdo it, but it's very much a story that is being told by me. And I decided to make that explicit in the introduction, in the sentence that you quoted, because usually what I would do and what most journalists would do is to say, "This is a true story." That's a classic sentence to write in a nonfiction book. This is a true story. And I wrote that in the first drafts of the book. This is a true story. And then, because these characters are so literary, because they wrote themselves and they wrote books and they read books, I kind of felt them breathing down my neck and looking over my shoulder. And I'm like, did they think this is a true story? Like, they're reading my book. Is this true? Does this strike them as a true version of what happened to them? And of course, they probably wouldn't, even though I've tried to be as accurate as possible. So instead, I went for a subjective claim, which is this is a totally true story. I'm not making anything up. There's no invented dialogue here or invented characters. There are long source notes at the end of the book for anyone who's interested. But this is my own jump, for lack of a better word, into the story of the parachutists.
So we need to finish in just a minute, so this will be the last question. Unfortunately, this has been so interesting and brings out so much richness in the book and really puts it in it to brings it to light and a new perspective. So thank you for sharing all these thoughts with us. Um, I had mentioned the words heroism and resistance as two words that felt really important and sort of emblematic of the book. And I'd love to end with your reflections on a third term, which is rebirth. That word is part of the subtitle of your book, Out of the Sky, Heroism and Rebirth in Nazi Europe. Who's being reborn in this story? And is there something from this historic episode that can help nurture a more contemporary rebirth as well?
Right. I mean, the rebirth, I don't make much of it in the book, but this is not, I mean, it's a tragedy in many ways, like in the literary sense of that word, but it's in the service of a rebirth that is miraculous, that that happens after the greatest tragedy in the history of the Jewish people. We have this renaissance, which I'm a part of. Again, I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem. We take it for granted. We've grown up with it. We don't appreciate it enough. But I have four kids who speak Hebrew as their mother tongue and think that's totally normal. Like
Mm.
100 years ago, no one spoke that, or 120 years ago, no one spoke that language. It wasn't a spoken language. So we're living in this miraculous rebirth that happens after this mass death. And these characters are part of it, and they understand it. They're at a kind of a hinge moment in history, and they set out to kind of push with their own lives, essentially, the move of the Jewish people from this mass grave in Europe to rebirth in the land of Israel. That's what they're doing. It works. That part of the mission works, and I'm a beneficiary of it. Many of us are, and that's the rebirth I'm talking about, which is, I think, that one that we need to think about and appreciate, particularly now when this rebirth is under assault across the world and in grave danger. So if we want to preserve the rebirth, we're really going to have to think about it and be a bit heroic about our choices in the next couple of years.
Well, thank you so much for that answer and all the answers. So illuminating and such a fascinating, not just story, but stories and the way that you've helped me and I'm sure other readers understand the depth and richness of something that's been an important piece of the Jewish and Zionist story, but hasn't gotten the full treatment and interrogation it's deserved until now. So thank you, and thank you everyone who's joined us in the audience for being a part of this. Thank you so much to our partners, UJA Federation of New York, and thank you especially to my colleagues at 70 Faces Media, especially Thea and Beryl, who've organized everything and made this happen. It's been a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to the next one. I hope you'll join us then.